So we now have our character and our objects and pulsars and whatever drawing to our render targets. Let's now apply it to our foliage and or materials. So in the test level, if you go up to the top left corner, I've got a few examples of the inbuilt material functions that, you might find useful. So we've got the foliage bender, which bends foliage, funnily enough, in a direction. We've got the foliage wiggler, which applies a sort of random bend in random directions. We have the foliage jiggler, which is for like micro jiggle for the individual leaves and stuff. It do be jiggling. These bottom three are sampled at the pivot point. So only when the pivot point, hits it, they will jiggle. These ones up here are per vertex. So we just sample them using world position. So you can see that these leaves are interacting with the wind individually. And also if I run past them, only those leaves will interact. This is the foliage squisher, which squishes foliage down to the ground. Useful for like ferns and I guess like rubber plants and just general kind of ground debris. And then this one is the foliage pusher, which just pushes verts around, with our interaction bubble. It will also apply the velocity to them. This one looks a little bit wacky on its own, but when they are all combined together, we start to get, foliage that actually looks like foliage. So they're meant to be used in conjunction with one another. Where are these material functions? Well, if we go to any material, for example, we can go to this material, the wiggler. We have our Prismatiscape _ foliage wiggler. And you can see the inputs here. The wiggle amount is just, where or when we want this to wiggle. And we're going to drive our wiggle by using our Prismatiscape sample interaction bubbles and our Prismatiscape sample wind. So if you type Prismatiscape, you can see all of our material functions. If you type sample, it will get the the simulation render target that you want. And it will be automatically at the correct position with the correct UVs using the material parameter collection values that it needs. Now, a lot of these also require a mask of some sort. These masks don't actually get applied to the world position offset. You do need to apply them afterwards. If we wanted the roots of the leaves to stay in place like this, we would need to mask that afterwards. The reason that we have these masks is so we can do time distortion. So looking at our foliage wiggler, you can see that it is wiggling. However, if we go into the material instance, we can see that we have some settings. We have the wiggle root to tip time distortion. If this root to tip time distortion is at 1, you can see that the leaves have this sort of weight to them. If it's at 0, you can see that the leaves are completely stiff, as well as the height time distortion. You can see that the bush is just completely stiff. But when we apply height distortion, you can see that, the bottom moves before the top. And when we apply the root to tip time distortion, we get the ends of the leaves move after the starts of the leaves. So that's what those masks are for. Now, all of these effects are automatically scaled, just using the scale of the object. So you can see that the little ones go faster and they have less time distortion because they have less weight to them. Whereas the bigger versions have some, slower wiggle times and all that kind of stuff. So when you're doing your settings for your own foliage, the settings correlate to when the foliage mesh is at scale 1, and then anything smaller or larger than that will have its parameters adjusted automatically. So the last thing that we're going to talk about in our little foliage journey is grass, because grass is very common. Grass is a very common foliage type in games and apparently also in the real world. The grass is mainly reading from our deform render target, also known as the trampled deform in the material thingos. our goal for the grass is for the grass to bend when we walk over it. We also want it to be affected by the wind, but we don't want it to be affected by the wind when it has been trampled down to the ground. So you can see here, this grass, very trampled. When I blow wind on it, it doesn't get as affected as all the grass around it. You can also see that the default wind effect, like this, are not being applied when it is trampled. So if we look in our example materials, we go to grass 02. There is no grass 01. We can just have a little look at what is going on here. So right here, you can see that I have a little local variable called pivot point per blade of grass. So up here, this is a little bit unorthodox for pivot painting using vertex color, but if you know how, pivot painting works, then this is where you want your pivot point thingos. Otherwise, just use, the pivot point or use the world position. For like an individual bush or an individual piece of grass, this is good. For a clump of grass that each blade is pivot painted, this is good. And then lastly, if you're using grass cards, then you'll probably want to use world position. But anyway, whatever that is, that's where we're going to sample our render targets from. So if we look at this kind of jumbled mess over here, you can see that we have our wind, we have the water, and we have the trample deform, also just known as the deform render target. And we are using the foliage wiggler and the foliage bender. So what things do we want to bend our grass? Well, if we follow this little node, you can see that we are getting the sample trample deform and getting the deform vector. We're also multiplying it by 1.5 just so it's a little bit stronger than the wind. And then in addition to that, we are getting the wind vector. So that's like the wind's velocity and direction. So we're adding them together. And then we're also adding the water normals, and we're multiplying that by a very small number so that it isn't as kind of crazy. So we just add them all together, we chuck them into the bend amount, and it gets added over here. We'll get back to why it gets added after all this other stuff in a sec. So then on top of that, we have the foliage wiggler, which just wiggles foliage like this. And into that, we are putting the deform velocity, which is like a very short-term couple of channels that, when we trample something, we draw the velocity to it. And then we're also adding the water disturbance mask, which is just the normals absoluted and the height map, and add them together. And then we're also adding the wind vector, so that, when the grass gets blown by the wind, it will kind of just jiggle around randomly in addition to bending. Now, the way that I'm adding all of them together is a little bit unorthodox. It's a little optimization, I guess, where we absolute the R and the G values, and these are G values, add them together, then get the length, rather than getting the length of all of them and then adding them together. Keep that in mind. It's a nice little trick. If we didn't absolute them, then, the negative values from the R and the G could cancel out other RG values, which isn't really what we want. Now, this little bit here, I am using that terrible simple grass wind that's included with the engine. Basically just saying when the wind is affecting the grass, we want to increase the intensity of, that terrible default grass wind. And then over here, we're getting all of our, wiggle and jiggle stuff, and we want to zero that out when the trample deform vector is 1, or when something is trampled, we want to get that bit that it's trampled, then we want to invert that, 1 minus it, and then multiply all of the other stuff by that. And that's why we add the bending after that, cancellation of all the wind stuff. Then lastly but not leastly, we just get the vertex color, or you could use like a height mask or something, and we just multiply by that, just so that the roots of the grass stick in the ground and they don't move from the ground. And then that just goes into world position offset, and that is the grass. Well done.